Route setters do not determine the outcome of the competition. This idea that you can be like so precise or so sure to know the exact outcome is a little bit like, to put it frankly, like delusional. There's an element of chance and uncertainty to what goes on in our sport that cannot be controlled. There are certain things that we do control, putting the holds onto the wall. And I'm not saying that we don't have an influence. Like, by no means am I suggesting that route setters have no influence on what goes on in competition. There's just some amount of luck that goes into what's going on. And and then the other part of that is like, people think it's like the route setters versus the athletes, and it's not. It is like a symbiotic relationship. We want them to succeed as much. We want there to be a great show as much as the athletes want to win.
Garrett Gregor, welcome to the Testpiece podcast, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today. Still recovering a little bit from the Olympics, but getting back on my feet.
Little different time zone there. Garrett, I'm so psyched to have you here today. I really appreciate you coming on. For me, this is a topic, route setting in the Olympics, which you kind of just foreshadowed a little bit there, that I think is super interesting. But on top of that, you have this kind of rare trifecta that I like in climbers where you climb really hard. Well, you climb hard both in competition, you're a competitive climber, outdoors, you've climbed extremely hard, you've coached, and you're a high level route setter. And just all those combinations of different skills, I think really lets you see climbing from a bunch of different angles. So, on top of being the head route setter for the Paris Olympics bouldering, I'm just psyched for all those other reasons too, man. So, thanks for coming on, dude.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to share from my last 25 years or so of climbing experience, whatever I can.
You just let everyone know how old you are, man. Well, that's how long have you been setting out of those 25 years?
I've been setting for about almost that whole time. I started setting shortly thereafter. So I've been setting roughly like 22, 23 years or so.
Wow. Well, let's get into that. Where'd you start? How just you get into climbing, and what were those early years like?
Yeah, the the like origin story of my climbing. The first time I ever tried climbing was actually like at a sixth grade camp. It was just like some rinky-dink wall at the back of the sixth grade camp that we or fifth grade camp, I forget which, that we went to. First time I ever tried it, and then a buddy of mine took me to the local climbing gym, Hangar 18 in Upland, for his birthday party, and this was like the seventh or eighth grade. And I was like super involved in sports growing up, and going into high school, um, I was going to do soccer and wanted to get back into shape for soccer season. I was like, oh, I'll go back to the climbing gym. Like, I kind of liked climbing, and I'll go back in there. And people always think I'm joking when I say this, but it took me 2 weeks to do my first V0, and I was just like hooked. A lot of other things kind of came easy to me. It was like, I shouldn't say like came easy, but like I was fairly natural. Like, I was pretty good at soccer, I was pretty good at school. But climbing was something that did not come easy in any way, shape, or form. And I liked that about it. I liked that it was tough to do. And so yeah, after that, I that was kind of like the pivotal moment actually in my career. Like, I always my one of my favorite questions to people is like, what's the question that you asked that's like, or the thing that you did that made you who you are? And so like I made the decision to not do music in high school, and made the decision to do sports, and thus like carried went to the climbing gym. And anyways, so yeah, from there I like in 2007 I took my first one of the first level one USA climbing courses in the country, with Chris Danielson at Hangar 18 Riverside. Um, and Yeah, before that even, I like started setting at Hangar 18. This was back before gyms even had head route setters. It was like not a it wasn't a profession by any means. And so you would pick up a wrench like every now and then when the gym like decided to reset the climbs and I was like, "Oh, that looks cool. Can I join y'all?" And they're like, "Yeah, next time." And so, yeah, did the first level one in 2007, did my level two a couple years thereafter in 2009. Um, I think I did my first bouldering nationals maybe in 2011, setting for first bouldering nationals. I competed at several boulder and lead competitions. I made several lead finals, one boulder final. I did fourth place, I think, in like 2013. And I competed at an adult level. There were no even like real youth categories for bouldering back then. So when I was like 15, 16, you immediately like jump into the adult. I did my first World Cup as a forerunner, I think in 2014, and got to set my first World Cup boulder problem then. I was nominated to the IFSC in 2018. Was the second U.S. person nominated after Chris Danielson. And like the first after quite some time. I think he was nominated back in the early 2010s or something like that. And so it took quite a while, but now we have Chris, myself. Well, Chris is like fairly retired because he coaches now, and then myself, Brad Weaver, um, a number of others actually just got nominated this year. There's too many to list, but the IFSC brought on a huge pool of USA climbing route setters over the past year that were nominated. So it's cool to see that they're kind of like following suit with the levels of USA climbing. And then yeah, was that with Team ABC for nearly a decade, from 2010 to 2019 as a coach, head route setter, director of operations there. I did complex climbing, my own coaching, setting, clinics thing. I was a director of bouldering project for a while, so I've done a little bit of everything.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like it would have been easier to ask you, what have you not done in climbing? I gotta ask, when you said something along the lines of picking up a wrench at the local gym, were they actually still using wrenches back then? Did you guys have drills yet, or was it still wrenches?
No, 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 it was T wrenches. That was the
Brutal.
first thing you did was you picked up the red handle T wrench and yeah, I mean, funny enough, I even did that at my first job in Boulder at the spot because they had kind of notoriously finicky T nuts, and so you had to use a T wrench.
The reason why that always sounded so tricky to me is that, especially as a newer setter, it's hard to know where you really want the hold. It's just, you look at the wall, you think, oh, maybe this is the right distance. But I'm wondering if now maybe that ability to just know where to put it and not, just commit is good, because I feel like there's way more screw-ons now, and I don't know how. I never, when I set, I didn't set with that many screw-ons because the walls were not plywood and they just beat up the walls. So, when you set with a lot of screw-ons, do you do a lot of movement, or is it just kind of one and done?
Some it depends, you know. Sometimes the wall looks like Swiss cheese when you're done. Sometimes you get it right first shot. And you know, I do think there's something to be said for it's kind of like, without getting too philosophical, it's like doing something by hand before you work with the machine, right? It's like it teaches you a little bit there. I don't know if you, one of my favorite documentaries, I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's called Euro Dreams of Sushi. Actually
Oh
wasn't
yeah.
planning on talking about this. Yeah, Euro Dreams of Sushi. And they like make the people just learn how to make rice for a whole year. And all you're doing is focusing on the rice. And so I think when you like take that sort of like care and attention to something, it definitely gives you a whole other appreciation for that thing, and it gives you a whole level of different level of understanding for that thing.
Yeah, I don't know who had sushi on their bingo scorecard for today's topics, but good one. I love that documentary, and there is some good analogy there of just using the wrench instead of the drill, and just taking your time, because it develops, probably develops your intuition over the long haul. Uh, you mentioned these different levels, and I know what you're talking about, but could you just maybe explain a little bit about those certification levels and how they work in setting? Because even people who set maybe aren't as familiar with those as I know you are.
Yeah, well, within the USA Climbing route setting system that was developed over the years, there's a hierarchy of levels within the system, and it starts at level one. A level one clinic is fairly basic and teaches you a little bit about the fundamentals of route setting, how you move holds, what it means in a commercial and competition environment. And then from there, you start to work at, if you want to move up the ranks of the USA Climbing route setting system, which is focused much more on competition route setting, which is what USA Climbing is a competition organization. From there, you start to work at, local qualifying events, regional events, divisional events, that sort of thing. And then you can get into a level two clinic that's much more competitive to get into. People that come to those clinics have a much higher level, bigger back, longer, stronger background within route setting. Um, and then from there, you work your way up the ranks. Back when I was coming through the ranks, you would have to like intern your way at events to like, I slept on couches, I slept on floors, I didn't get paid for events. Fortunately, the industry has evolved, at least within USA Climbing to some extent. I still hear stories every now and then, but I think by and large it's gotten a lot better in that respect. And so yeah, you'll do events between there to make it to level three, and then from there you kind of get like these individual endorsements for whether or not you are qualified specifically to be a head route setter of a bouldering competition or a lead competition. And then there's like a level four and a level five, and you take like practical exams in between then with other head route setters, other level five route setters. Level five right now is the top, and then from there, you can be nominated, or not even from level five. I think even from within level four or five. I'm not sure where they went back to for this current round of or pool of applicants, but USA Climbing nominates route setters to go to the international pool, and the IFSC has their own level system now. They just do one, two, three, and four, and and that has its own criteria as well.
Yeah, gosh, you sound like you were, I mean, you were really early to the high level route setting game and then going international. I can't believe that you were only the second person to be inducted into, is that the ability to set at World Cups internationally?
Well, I wasn't the second person to like ever set a World Cup, to be clear. Like, there's been plenty of people that have set World Cups um, way before me, and people that don't even set now. Seth Lighton, uh, um, what Johnny Hork, like there's all sorts of
Yeah.
people, Max Olatuka, and people that don't really set anymore per se, that had set World Cups back when I was coming up. So but the International Federation of Sport Climbing didn't really accept new applicants until 2017. And I think for me, I think there was like four or five people that had been nominated, and I was selected out of those people. And then a few years later, they selected one or two more. Or Brad was nominated, and or Brad and several others were nominated. They selected Brad. Uh, and then there was a diversity program. Flannery Shane Emerald was inducted
Yeah.
as part of that diversity program, and then now we have this whole pool of applicants.
Okay, that makes sense. It sounds like it's just good to hear America being better represented in the World Cups. And I gotta say, it seems like in the last 5 years, all of a sudden the World Cup scene has been full of Americans and us vying for the podiums in an amazing way too. Were you always paying attention to World Cups back in, I don't know, like in the early teens? Because I feel like only a certain kind of climber and competitor really cared about the World Cups. And even if you were a competitive climber, often in America, you were focused on ABS nationals. What's been your opinion of World Cups or your psych on them over the last decade?
Good question. You know, in general, climbing media was harder to come by back in, people don't know this now, but climbing media was hard to come by back in 2012, 2010, or whatever. Um, and so that proliferation of media has, I think, certainly helped a new generation of people get interested in the sport and understand the sport. For me, the interest in competition or competitive climbing was a natural one just because I was a competitor myself, and was a route. So like I didn't approach it like as a lens strictly from a route setter, like what's going on at a World Cup level. I was interested in it because I wanted to get to that next level of competition. And as a competitor, that's always what you wanted to get to. And at the time it was like you wanted to go to Vail. Vail was like the World Cup you wanted to go to because it was on home soil, and yeah, so you always wanted to get that jacket. You wanted to represent your country at the Vail World Cup, and so yeah, that's where my interest came from, probably.
I remember that the Vail World Cup seemed to be, if Americans were going to win anything, it was going to be the Vail World Cup, and it was talked about that the setting was different there, that it was more straightforward and powerful compared to the other comps at the time. Was that true? Do you think, from your perspective, is that true, or is that just something that we said because, well, you didn't have to travel halfway across the world, and is there any validity to that?
I think there's an element of that that could be true from like back in the early days of when we were first hosting World Cups. The proliferation of volumes and macros was not as widespread over here. So ours tended to be, let's say, like more straightforward in terms of dimensionality on the wall. They tended to maybe be like more progressive in the sense of like just straightforward climbing, and maybe to that extent a little bit longer. But to the extent that it is true now, I think so. I hear some people still say that, and I just don't agree. I think that what USA Climbing has done with the route setting program, Chris Danielson especially, to introduce the like modern aspects of route setting, the exposure that people get to different styles of climbing these days, be it outside, inside, watching World Cups, going to other gyms, etc., has really created a much more homogenous. You still have like certain things that maybe certain people or certain groups of people are better at, um, but I don't think that real differentiation of styles exists to the extent it does anymore. And some of that also was born. The third thing I think is some of that was also born out of the style of scoring that we had. So the style of scoring we had back in those early days was, if you remember, some people might not remember this, we had a points per hold. Even on the bouldering side of things, that evolved. We then had like a zone thing, but we went back from the zones, and then we did uh, points per hold, but also similar to what we do in lead, where we take like the root of those. It basically like keeps it so that you're not weighting one higher than the other, but it makes the math much more complicated to understand. So no route is worth like 25 points anymore, or no boulder is worth 25 points. They become based on like how many people do them. So yeah, we evolved our scoring system and currently have aligned with what the IFSC does, to some extent. Our youth categories are still a little bit different, but um,
I appreciate the latest scoring system in that there's big numbers on the wall that help me understand. And it's like the higher you go up, the bigger the number. And I just, it was a little complex there for a while. And it was always a bummer when you'd watch and not understand what a competitor had to do to, take the lead. So
for
uh,
sure.
appreciate the evolution. On that evolution idea, eh, how has the how has the comp setting changed in the last decade, and how has that inclusion of volumes and macros, led that change or been part of the variable for that change?
It's been a huge part of that, I think that if we look at it over the years, volumes, holds, macros, walls themselves have really evolved over the last 15 plus years. If you look back to where we started 20, 25 years ago, it was so different, like almost unrecognizable to what we have nowadays. And that allows us to do things where we build out the walls. We used to have fiberglass walls that we couldn't screw into, or concrete walls that were much harder to screw into, I should say. And that creates its own field of play. Setting proficiency has gone up. As I said before, like I was involved in one of the first level one clinics, and now I think they hold something like 20 clinics a year for level one, um, and they're almost always full. So the setting proficiency has gone up significantly. The proliferation of gyms has gone up. Back when I started, there was one Hangar 18 in Upland. I think they have 12 gyms in the Southern California area now, and that's just one example. I don't know the exact numbers in the US, but overall across the globe, there are so many more gyms and so much more such a lower barrier of entry for people to get into climbing or find their local climbing gym, I should say. There's still maybe the smooth barriers. And just that overall level. The other thing I'll say is like that professionalism. I think USAC route setters themselves still really exemplify and have drove that forward. So that professionalism has helped us to develop. And then, the people that have just the individuals that have helped drive that change, people like Manu Hassler, owner of Flathold, these like sort of like setting icons, Jackie Godoff, Chris Danielson, Percy Bishton, people that have been involved in the industry forever in one way, shape, or another, that have given their like creativity and vision to the sport. And I without people like Manu, Laurent Report, we might not have paddles. And we all stand on the shoulders of giants and like build off of those things.
Love those shout outs, especially Chris Danielson. I can't believe that he's been at the cutting edge of setting forever. I mean, he's been doing it forever. On that topic of how it's changed, you were there for one of the first level one clinics, and you just got back from teaching a level one clinic. What's the curriculum? What was the curriculum like back then compared to now?
When I did it, I think it was only like a day long clinic, and now it's much more involved. It's 2 days long. Um, Setters are required to put up an entire top rope route. Sometimes it'll be on like a lead terrain, but competitors, excuse me, clinic participants are required to put up a route on the first day. They work with each other to critique and iterate on those initial designs, and then come together for an assessment at the end of the day. And then the second day, we go through a bunch of different exercises on the bouldering terrain, where they are tested for efficiency, fairness, function, and have three main different exercises. And it's split between a little bit of classroom time and a little bit of like hands on the holds time.
What's efficiency? Is it like time it takes to put up a boulder?
Yeah, this is one thing that I think USA Climbing really does super well actually is and maybe this is just like there's definitely like certain groups that are a little bit better at this, like Japanese I think generally tend to prize efficiency um in terms of like setting goes. I'm not trying to make like just some like overall stereotype, but in terms of setting, uh, Japanese people tend to like put something up and make iterations on it pretty quickly. In America, like one of the exercises we do within USA Climbing at a level one clinics, you'll have like 30 minutes to put up a climb and forerun it. or get like your first draft done. And so it like pushes them to like not get too attached to things, to be adaptable to different situations. Because when you get to events that have a lot of different things going on, Bouldering Youth Nationals, for example, you might have 6 or 7 or 8 different categories that you've got to set with and or set for, and a bunch of different people you've got to work with, and you've got to be able to get through those things instead of spending 8 hours on one boulder or one move, as some people might.
Yeah, I just remember my saying days and how quick some people were, but then also that idea of not getting too attached to things is, yeah, that's a hard one as a beginner setter because you fall in love with some specific move, and I can imagine in the comp world everything can change on a dime where, hey, like the finals route's actually going to overlap this part, so we need you to completely redo that move that you had written in your journal and you were in love with for 6 months that you brought here. uh, I'm curious how these. I mean, we'll get to the Olympics in a moment, but maybe when we were talking about the World Cups, I was curious, like, how do they decide who the setters are, and like how many are there? Are they from all parts of the world? Because we were talking about, oh, is the American one set differently? And maybe 10 years ago, maybe it was, but you said now maybe that's kind of a fallacy. Is that are are countries represented appropriately, or do you know what I'm saying there or
Yeah,
asking
yeah,
there?
yeah. I get it. Just to like kind of nuts and bolts of how that's done, the IFSC has a pool of route setters that they draw from. They have a route setting commission that they work with, and then a board of directors that ultimately approves the nominations. And so the route setters commission, a couple individuals will work together to say like, okay, this person works better with this organizer, this person fits better here, this person has a schedule constraint here, and so they work to create those initial nominations. Um, and then they'll send out those nominations to the pool of route setters, and we can either accept or decline those invitations. Some other like fundamental guidelines on those. Sorry, those get sent to the board, and then we can either accept or decline, and then they might go through another process of revision from there. Um, then after that, uh, you know, the the other guidelines that I mentioned, or stipulations I should say, are that like the head route setter can't be from the host country. So in the US you can't have a US head route setter. In France you can't have a French head route setter. And so that's like one of the other constraints that that nominating group has to work within. And then the organizing committee, or I should say the organization that's hosting, the hosting organization, also has a certain number of slots that they can allocate to their national group of setters. However many that they and the IFSC work with, sometimes it's as few as 2 or 3 people, sometimes it's as many as 4 or 5 or 6 people. That's actually how I got one of my starts at Vail. I was brought on as an official forerunner from USA Climbing. And so, yeah, like the host gets to say like, okay, we're gonna pay for 5 people to come and set this event in addition to the 3 people that have been nominated from the IFSC. And typically it's only like three. It used to be, I think, as few as 2 people that were nominated to do like a World Cup. And yeah, now I think it's 3, and I think there's talks of maybe going to 4. But the idea was that you could be able to do it with your own self-contained group of IFSC setters, or should be able to do it. But it's just such a huge workload for those 3 individuals. Or
How does it work with volume and hold choice available to you guys?
that's also something else that's has a few nuanced areas to it. Organizers sometimes have sponsors that they work with, and so maybe sometimes they have like certain uh, opinions of what they would like represented in what rounds or what boulders. Some people are very particular, some people are less particular, or I should say, some hosts are less particular, and some hosts are less opinionated. But um, Yeah, they typically have to pull from IFSC has an official catalog of
That's
like brands that have specifically for holds, volumes, and macros that they can choose from, and then they can select from there.
right. Do you guys have any tricks for making holds better or worse than a competitor may think they are? Like I just remember, I want to say one year I think we even got these at the gym I was at. We got like shallow pours of a common set, where they had done holds specifically to look like those holds, but then they were shallow ports, so they were worse. But I know that there's all sorts of ways to like put a little tape behind to make it push out. Like, do you guys do that, or is there any kind of little tricks of the trade that you can share?
That's so funny that you brought up those two examples because at one bouldering nationals, just to like get a little bit more in cut to something, there was a boulder that we worked on that you had to like jump and catch something with one hand and just hang it. And so like everybody was feeling it's a little bit too hard, it's a little bit too hard. And so I stacked like a three, four pieces of tape behind it to like give it a little bit more, like shim it out just a little bit. Um, and yeah, we'll do things like that, or we'll do things like depending how much time you have too, that can make difference. I've done things like gone so far as like take Bondo. Many routes have done this, like cover up bolt holes so that people can't pry their way into those, and then spray paint over it. I've gone so far as to like take a grinder to a hold and like completely make a dual text and polish and sand uh, like a particular part of a hold so that somebody couldn't step on that part of the hold. So yeah, we'll do things like that. I'd say the most common nowadays is to like shim things out with other things. Is really it's probably become like the easiest and most commonplace.
Dude, it's mind blowing to me that you can adjust something like in that in cut crimp example to make it just a little bit better, that you guys are so dialed into what you're looking for that literally pushing the crimp out a half a millimeter is meaningful, and was the result, or was what you guys were intending for those climbers to do. That's just wild that you guys have it dialed to that minutia.
Well, I'll caveat this just by saying like, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, in a little bit, but the group has an idea of what it thinks the level should be, right? And so, one route setter might be adamant that like, no, it's fine without the tape, and there might be two or three others that are like, no, it needs to be a little bit easier. And so instead of, you do things like that, instead of grabbing an entirely different hold that's significantly different, you do things to like make it incrementally different, or you like move it two or three screw holes. Like there's a Japanese route setter, so this goes around all the time. Like you move one DK is one screw hole. Um, and so you do little things like that to make minor adjustments, and that's when you end up with the wall looking like Swiss cheese. But
Love
yeah,
that.
sometimes it makes a huge difference. And the caveat that I'll say is like we don't ever know. And we'll get into this in a little bit, but like there's absolutely no way to be certain of what happens, and again we'll go into that a little bit.
That is one of the best topics. Okay, we'll go in that too. I got one more question on this little tricks of the trade. I'm curious about you guys' use, or maybe you don't ever use it, of tick marks. I When I would set commercially, sometimes we would want to tell people, "Hey, there's a hold around the arete, and we want to just draw your eye. That we want to help. We're helping." But then sometimes you don't want to do that. How's that work in competition? And maybe even just it could be a broader question there, where where I see chalk on a hold or a volume can be an indicator of potential beta. Do you guys think about that forerunning? Sorry, I tossed in two questions there, but
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I'm following you. Yeah, to the ticking topic, there's a rule that says like competitors cannot make their own tick marks on the wall. However, route setters sometimes it's more common on lead. a lot less common in bouldering, particularly because in lead, climbers might be looking like way up the wall and not notice something around a corner. And so because it's 30, 50 feet off the ground, they're led in a little way. And secondarily is that they don't have brushers that are going like uh, I don't want to say like going rogue, but brushers that maybe didn't see that tick mark. Like a lot of the brushers on the bouldering side of things are just volunteers that come up and are able to like do that work really quickly. However, the brushers that go up on the lead are typically route setters, and so they know like we need to keep this tick mark specifically for this. But part of the reason we don't typically use those things is because you might lose that within the course of the round of competition, and then you are giving some sort of advantage to one person or another. And then the second part of that is like part of at least the format as it currently stands now. I think another topic we'll get into at some point. The format as it stands now is partially due to them figuring things out and learning for themselves. And so you don't want to give too much away. And so it's always like trying to strike that balance.
All right, that was good. I guess when I'm spectating and you have these perfect camera angles, you'll see these giant slopers, and then there'll be some jib that makes that sloper not so hard. And it's amazing how often climbers are able to seemingly intuit where the jib will be. And it's just, I don't know, I just wondered, like, when you put those jibs in inconspicuous places, is that purposeful, just that kind of jib on a hold idea, and why to tick it or not to tick it is something I'd love to hear more on.
Yeah, I'll say it's not so much that they become easy, they become less hard. And they, it's not always to, sometimes it's to make things easier. Sometimes we'll put things up like entire volumes up to like make a section of the wall almost unusable or like create a space such that it's hard to put your body in here. So like sometimes we'll do things for like entirely different reasons, but yeah, you're always trying to strike this balance between like letting the climbers figure it out. And this also is contingent on the round of competition you're setting for. In a qualifying and semis round of competition for bouldering, they don't have a preview. In a finals round, they do have a preview. And so that also gets factored in as to like what level of complexity can we go into, where do we need to put holds, what can they see. But you know, the other thing I'll say is you said like the climbers into it, but the climbers that are good at this, it's not so much intuition only. Like there is a lot of preparation that goes into, and they do it quickly. Uh, the best climbers, they're able to like look around and quickly see and identify where things could be um, less or more inconspicuous, or where things could instinctively you might want to grab something here, so I'm going to look to see like is there anything else that could be up there. And so yeah, they're looking at all of those things like very very quickly within 10 15 seconds, and then jumping on and getting their attempt started.
Yeah, this is why it's cool when someone like you has done all three sides of that, the competing, route setting, coaching, and just, it's all kind of gives you a bigger toolbox to assess things quickly. And I say intuition, what makes me think of is I was in, I won't name names. I was outside and I had some project, and my buddy who is a pro climber on site it with no with no trouble, and it blew me away because it oftentimes this happens on rock where you have to reach really far back on some giant shelf, and then there's like the perfect crimp. And I was always blown away by people with unbelievable amounts of experience on rock, how somehow it's like they could just, I felt like they could just look at the rock and somehow know where the good hold would be on some giant shelf. And I was wondering if competitors were doing something similar. But I think what you're saying there is better, where it's more of a quickness to learn it than it is just blind understanding.
And it's a skill unto itself. in both disciplines or both like aspects of the sport, right? In rock climbing and in the sport of climbing, another topic that I would like to dive into. But like in, in rock climbing, learning how to read different types of rock and what you might be able to grab or not grab, or what you might be able to stand or not stand on, that's all something that develops over time and you learn over time. And then secondarily, you have like different ability levels. So people that have like a higher threshold for their ability levels are able to do things or have more time to adapt on the wall is maybe the best way to put it.
Dude, this is what I love about the newer era of competition climbing is when you see a really great climber get, I don't want to say flustered, but they have some path they're going down and then it's not going great and they just think, "Oh boy, I need to find another foot or I need to move my hand." And you just see them grab these macros or volumes in like 8 different ways in like 8 seconds too. They're like, "We're gonna press here. Is this an underclink? Can I toe hook?" And just watching them go through a million options that seem and then often like land on one that I just would have never picked. Like good on you guys for those setting options being available or those climbing options be available. But I don't. This is a yeah, Garrett. There's way too many topics, but I gotta ask this one. How do you guys set so that there's multiple options available to do a climb without one being significantly easier to the extent that it's just like, well, everyone has to do it this way?
uh,
Is that level five? Is this level five certification question?
well, it's just it's a big question with a big answer. Um, there's a couple parts to that. One is, sometimes as setters, you might be looking specifically to have a very specific sequence, and the reason for that being that in a competition environment, right, we would like to think that the climbers would be tested equally, right? So if they experience the same sequence in the same way, um, then that is quote unquote fair. And so that's kind of like the ideal. Um, that being said, everyone is different, and like no two climbers experience the same. Like you might go to a climb and be having an awesome day. You're just like full of life and super excited and motivated about something, and you go into the gym or you go up to your project or whatever, and you have a totally different experience. And then the next day, I don't know, maybe you're sad about something. Maybe life's not going the way you like, and you have another totally different experience. And like nothing has changed. Like maybe the weather is the same, all other variables being the same. Like that's a totally different experience on that climb. So something even as small as like an individual's perception or emotional capacity that day can influence dramatically what happens on any given day. And so I say that just to say that this notion that we can make the exact same experience for every single competitor out there is something that just isn't realistic. um, and furthermore, like I think when we take that approach, we're able to look at something and say like, okay, well, we're going to try to balance it as best we can. So then when we have a movement that is maybe someone small is going to do it in this way, or we think someone small is going to do it in this way, and it's of approximately this level of difficulty. Okay, well, now we think, okay, well, how might the person of a totally different body style do this? And let's try to balance those out as best we can. Um, and so in that way, you give options and you try to balance it out, but you're never able to do that to the degree of certainty that everybody would like or would think. And to that point, I just think that again, like something else we might get into, but um, there's there's a certain element of that is just ingrained in sports. You have certain body types, you have certain abilities that go into sports, and it's not to say that you can't have other abilities or body types go into those sports. My favorite example to go to is basketball. And everybody's going to say, oh, but basketball is so fundamentally different. But basketball, you have Muggsy Bogues, who was something like 5'4" or something like that, and played in the NBA. There's also some other statistic that like 1 in 6 people above 7 feet are already in the NBA. And so like it's just to say like there is a certain body type that goes into that, and then you have people like Steph Curry that's 6 foot, looks tiny on the court, and has fundamentally changed the game of basketball in the last 10 years. Um, and so different people are able to make their mark in a different way, uh, regardless of what the field of play looks like.
That's interesting to take an extreme example like NBA, where you would, in general, I think people would argue, oh, well, you have to be 7 foot or whatever, extremely tall, and then point out that I mean, Steph Curry is arguably got to be one of the most popular and badass basketball players right now. Like, I mean, he's up there. If you're going to talk about who's the best in the NBA right now, you're going to bring him up. And he's, I don't know if I call him short. I'm not quite 6 foot, so I don't want to call him short. But because you said this, and
But short for the NBA for sure.
yeah, and I feel like we're stealing your the good to great you were telling me about this idea of yeah, maybe you can just say it and put it together with that Steph Curry example.
Well, with Steph Curry, I think I'll save the good to great for later, but like Steph Curry before he came into the NBA, everybody said like, "Oh, he's not going to make it. You're too short, whatever." The game was played at a time where it was dominated by big centers. You would get the ball in, you would make field goals. The three-pointer wasn't as common. Steph Curry came in and completely upended what teams do. And of course, statisticians like also gave maybe the teams the free, like we could talk about, I don't want to turn this into a basketball podcast, but like Steph Curry has changed what the NBA does. There's even talks of like moving the 3-point line again because of what has happened in the NBA and how prolific he has been. And for sure, yeah, he's going to go down as one of the greatest of all time because of what he's been able to do.
So in climbing, when we see climbing at the very highest level in any discipline of climbing, in any whether it's outdoors, indoors, lead climbing, or bouldering, it always strikes me as amazing that we see massive variation in body types. That there's you know there's tall, there's short, there's muscular, there's really thin, and I guess I'm connecting to this to something we were talking about before, where it's that question of do route setters determine the outcome of the competition, and this is all weaves into what we've just been talking about.
Um, no. Short answer is no. Route setters do not determine the outcome of the competition. Um, I think there's a couple different things I want to hit on here, and you know, some setters, and to go back to this idea of like how do we balance those things, like you have to kind of know the rules before you can break them, is one saying. So like you have to understand how movement works and why certain movement works and how you can encourage certain types of movement before you can start to understand how all of the different possibilities work together and how to balance those things. Um, but like some setters, I would say the more immature setters or people less developed in their setting careers like to fool themselves into believing that they control the results. But this idea that you can be like so precise or so sure to know the exact outcome is a little bit like, to put it frankly, like delusional. Like there's there's an element of chance and uncertainty to what goes on in our sport that cannot be controlled. There are certain things that we do control, putting the holds onto the wall. And I'm not saying that we don't have an influence. Like by no means am I suggesting that route setters have no influence on what goes on in competition. 100% agree that we have some influence, but I've thought about this a lot, and I'd say like I used to say it's like 50-50 us and the athletes, but I'd say it's like 49, 49 and 2. Part us, part athletes, and then like 2% luck. Like there's just like some element of what goes on, and going back to this notion of like how the emotional capacity of a person impacts their performance on any given day. There's just some amount of luck that goes into what's going on. And and then the other part of that is like, people think it's like the route setters versus the athletes, and it's not. It is like a symbiotic relationship. We want them to succeed as much. We want there to be a great show as much as the athletes want to win. And so it's not necessarily us against the athletes. It is this like kind of symbiotic relationship. But to go back to your other question of like, do route setters control the outcome? I Yeah, like we can certainly influence, and when we're working on the margins, we might be able to like be pretty confident looking back that like if we put a jug somewhere, they could get to the top. But there's no way to guarantee that like that one small turn or that one piece of tape. I think back to that tape example. If we had taken that tape off, would they have still done it? I can't be sure. I can be, I can estimate like I think so, but there's no way to be sure. And so, would the ordering of the boulders have yielded quote unquote better outcomes? I don't know. And so there's a saying, hindsight is 2020, but in our profession, I'd say it's like hindsight's more like 2100. You can have moderate vision at best, because you don't ever get that option to replay. And so I looked this up actually recently because somebody told me this quote, but Ian Fleming had this quote that like once is happenstance, twice coincidence, and the third time he says is enemy action. The once and twice thing I think is what's really important, because like we only ever have one time to go out and sort of like experiment with what we have created. And so it's almost always happenstance. If we had a round of competition, let's say that we got to we got to do the exact same field of competitors, the exact same amount of time, and run that again, and then be able to like make some changes in between rounds, and then we didn't make changes. Okay, now we start to get into the area of like, okay, why didn't you make that change? Is that okay? Now it's kind of like just coincidence. And then if it happened a third time, well, then it's maybe more like a mistake. But this idea that like if we didn't get it right, it's a mistake. I think is a bit harsh, because you can never know what's going to happen. And there's a bunch of other sports that have course designers. I think again, I'm like a huge sports fan, so like everybody says, "Oh, climbing's so unique," but like golf has course designers that design the course and then move the pins in between rounds. Skiing, snowboarding, skateboarding, BMX, like they all have course designers. The difference, of course, is that those athletes get to practice on the field of play, and so they get to come out and learn how to work with that field of play, whereas we are always confronting um, these athletes with this particular challenge. And so, yeah, like other formats aside, which I think is worthy of an entirely other podcast segment, but like in a format where the same competitors competed on all the same boulders, and our job was to analyze and change something, and we didn't, then you might be able to start thinking that is like a mistake. But in our sport, where we have one chance to present everything to athletes, and then nearly everything is different, entirely different. Even timing from semis to finals. In semis, you have 5 minutes. In finals, you have an observation period and then only 4 minutes to climb on something. So like nearly every variable of each round is different. Previews versus not. Like the idea that you can glean too much from like one round to the next is also hard to put too much weight onto. So yeah, sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, it's amazing. And you actually made me think more about how other sports do have course design. And I don't know skateboarding well, but I was thinking about, oh, well, no, skateboarding doesn't matter because it's, people are scored based on their tricks. But now I was thinking like, let's say you're a rail specialist. And then when they design the course kind of front and center with some big giant rail that just looked good, like that's going to influence the result. So uh, that's that's really interesting, and it makes me think about how when you guys are planning, and maybe we can let's finally get into that really big competition that we were really going to dive into. You know, the Paris Olympics, which again, you were the head route setter for the bouldering. First of all, man, congratulations! What an amazing just thing to do in your career. And I said this in the last pod, or on one of my last pods. I loved it. I thought it was the biggest show ever, and it went amazingly well. So just congrats, man. That was so cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So let's use that as a bit of a microcosm for everything. Maybe it's not the microcosm. Maybe it's the comp
Because
for yeah, the cosm, big cosm. Uh, so you guys did a planning phase. There was a beginning, and I'd love to just kind of hear a blow by blow of what that was like. And the way I wanted to segue into that is that you did know the competitors coming into it, and so you kind of do know, hey, this person is this shape, or and I know that as a sports fan, as a climber, you probably know even the styles, quote unquote styles, that different competitors seem to excel at. And so how does that discussion go when you guys know the field, or do you even know the field when you start the planning phase for something like the Olympic bouldering rounds?
good question. You know, there's some route setters that work really specifically with certain athletes or certain federations more so than others. Um, there's some route setters that are like deep into like going around federation to federation, clinic to clinic, and so they get to see more of these route setters. But our job is really to be like as unbiased as possible, while still understanding what that field is capable of. And so to some degree, I'd like to think of myself as maybe a little bit more objective in the sense that like I don't do that as much anymore. Like I'm not going federation to federation and doing clinics. I'm not working with athletes. I'm not working with clinics. And so in some sense, like my involvement or um, the way I've like been ingrained in that community is maybe a little bit more removed, but I think that helps to make me a little bit more unbiased and objective. Um, but yeah, there's all sorts of things that go on in the planning phase, from like ideas that people have to, you know, IFSC has an input on what the guidelines are going to be. Athletes, coaches, the local organizing committee, the Olympic organizing committee. We have a test event that goes into the planning phase. There's so many stakeholders that go into like even down to the details of like what tape colors go on the wall and how does that fit within the brand of what the Paris Olympics are going to be, and what happens if the pink happens to go with the pink stripes on the wall. And so like there's so many different parts of that planning stage that are considered, and it's yeah it's really highly involved.
How early? When did you guys start planning the setting? Like how long ago, or how long before the Olympics actually happened?
Um, well, if you go down to like when was sort of the wall designed and that sort of thing, you could say it was even like with Tokyo, because the same wall was used, or a very similar wall was used in Tokyo. And the guidelines for what Boulder and Lead were started to be developed. I think even before Tokyo had finished. Don't quote me on that. I don't know exactly when that started, but like right around then. So some guidelines as to like how we were going to combine the Boulder and Lead disciplines. Um, so yeah, from a purely route setting perspective of like what that planning, what we plan out. I get nominated back in January, so fast forward, it's been like, you know, it's like 7 months until Paris. So there's about 7 months for purely like the route setting for Paris. And that includes like Olympic qualifying series, selecting final selection of which holds, in addition to like the main category of holds that have already been selected, uh, team selection, all those things.
So there's a ton of stakeholders and a ton of just people pushing what they want to do. And so there must be variables even like, how where are these camera angles? How do we make stuff look good on TV? And so I'd love to hear that, but I also think just because I'm a climber, a competitor, also I want to better understand the planning side of what you're trying to test the climbers on. And also, is it any different than how a World Cup planning goes? But just what were you? What's that discussion like? We're like, okay, we got 4 boulders, we got the best in the world. What kind of moves do we want to see on these boulders? What kind of holds? How is that categorization thought about?
Yeah. So again, that kind of happens in the planning phase, even prior to the nominating and selection of the team for Paris. Those guidelines that were developed with a team of different stakeholders, athletes, coaches, route setters, that all give opinions into like how this Boulder lead combined format should work, and then that ultimately helps to determine what those final guidelines are. So there are guidelines that govern the Boulder lead combined format. They're publicly available at the IFSC. I'll caveat that by saying like the guidelines themselves, I feel like are a little bit too specific and fall too much under the purview of um, this notion that we control the results to that degree. And so like you know, what I'll say is like this idea that we can or should control the outcome is pretty antithetical to what sports is. Like the whole point is that we don't dictate the outcome. Everybody hates a football match or sorry, soccer match where the ref was the one controlling the outcome of the game, and it would be ridiculous. I mean, again, basketball aside, we could talk all about the early 2000s, like Tim Donaghy and scandal. But, anyways, this idea that like we should give the refs or the officials like we want all games to end in a 1-2 outcome. Like that would be ridiculous to suggest to the officials like this is the only way the sport can be consumed. And and so that that point, I disagree that there should be that notion that like we can or should control the outcome to that degree. Um, but yeah, the guidelines themselves of like categories of boulders, styles of boulders that are represented, um, it is limiting to some extent, especially when combined with like the scoring format and 2 zones and needing the styles to be represented from 5 to 10 to 25. Like there are elements of that that are constraining for the sitting teams and make the work harder. There are elements of that that make it easier, for people to understand. So there's trade-offs with anything that you do. So there's some elements of the guidelines I think that are really good for our sport, and some elements of the guidelines that I think should be reconsidered.
Do you know those guidelines off the top of your head on what are being like what they say should be tested on those boulders?
Yeah, so like the guidelines themselves say that we should have an electric boulder, a power boulder, a coordination boulder, and a technical risk or balance boulder problem. And so that's why you see those like 4 disciplines or 4 styles represented so frequently within the boulder. And again, these guidelines currently govern only the boulder lead format specifically. Um, and so that's why you see those styles represented so frequently.
I don't know. Electric doesn't sound too restrictive to me. I feel like that's a pretty wide open category.
They are again those themselves are fairly subjective. Power is fairly straightforward and understanding for people. Coordination and electric start to get a little bit more conflated. The best way to describe those is people think of electric as like you get into fairly secure positions, but then you have to like explode out of them. By secure, I mean like more static positions, then you have to like do some dynamic movement out of those. And it can be like one, two sort of coordinated elements out of those. Coordination is again maybe like a more static position, but then you have to coordinate like three or more movements out of that position. And then a technical or risk boulder is fairly straightforward too. And the other thing I'll say there is like climbing climbing movements contain so many different questions for climbers. So even within a power boulder, there are technical elements that can be represented. There are route reading questions that can be asked within those single styles. Within a coordination, is it also powerful? Sure. Like it's powerful to explode out of a position. But those are like sort of like the baseline general principles for how you get there. And we want those to be represented from 0 to 5, from 5 to 10, from 10 to 25, and to be consistent all the way through.
So those four categories are those represented distinctly? I mean, you just said how they're not represented distinctly in each boulder, but when you think about those categories and when you're setting, is it like, okay, boulder number 3 is going to be a power boulder. This one, boulder number 2 is a technical boulder. Is that how it goes, or are those categories just somehow kind of like represented but jumbled up within each boulder?
Well, as I said, like they're jumbled up within each boulder to the extent that each movement contains multitudes of different skills or requirements in order to do it, because one move is not just one particular thing. Um, but they are split up into individual boulders. So in Paris, we had on from going from the rightmost side of the wall, we had the power profile, we had the electric profile, we had the coordination profile, and we had the technical risk profile. In finals, we could bounce around to different things, and this goes into like the variables that we have to consider and plan for. But in the semifinal round or other rounds, if we were running other competitions, you are limited to going in a pretty much linear fashion from one way to another.
That makes perfect sense. I it is, and yeah, I didn't want to confuse the idea that each each move has all those things kind of built into them, but just when you think about the guidelines, because you know, I like the power boulders maybe because of my old school, that kind of steep stuff on the right side of the Olympics wall. But then I could definitely argue that boulder number 1 often really seemed very powerful to me. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
like explode, jump, catch. Like, I mean, if that's not power, I don't know what is. But yeah, I still appreciate you just kind of abstracting it. I know these guidelines don't tell the whole story, but just it helps me understand what kind of structure is being put in. And the kind of like further question on that line of thinking is, each boulder has a 5 point zone, a 10 point zone, and a 25 point top. And how do you guys think about, like, we could take the power boulder, for example, like, is it that the hardest move should be between the 10 point and the 25 point because it's the
Precisely.
biggest? Okay, cool, cool. So it should be
Precisely.
like, all right, right. Yeah. Any
So
more to say about that? Yeah.
no, I mean your intuition is right, right? Because like from 0 to 5 is 5 points. From 5 to 10 is another 5 points. And you ultimately end up with 10 points minus any falls that might have accrued. Um, And from 10 to 25 points, however, is weighted in the sense that there are now 15 points available to you within this single sequence of movements represented within that boulder's stylistic uh, interpretation or whatever, however to phrase that. So, like on the electric boulders, you said we want from 0 to 5 to be electric, and for 5 points to be gained to be electric, and a certain number of people to get there because it's to get to 5 points. And then how to balance that with the lead is because to get to 5 points should be relatively easy, and we want to try to balance that with how many points they might be able to get on the lead route. From 5 to 10, again, a little bit harder. So this idea that boulders are getting a little bit more progressive, 5 to 10, and then from 10 to 25 being that much harder. Now, that being said, you might think, oh, well, then 10 to 25 is going to be like exponentially harder because it's 15 points and it's so much harder and it's worth more. That being said, like from 5 to 10, it's not like this simple mathematical equation where we can say it's going to be this much harder, especially because difficulty is always subjective. Um, but doing 5 to 10, especially on something like a coordination boulder, and then doing 0 to 5, and then doing 5 to 10, and then doing 10 to 25 is its own like puzzle that has to fit together. And so it's not necessarily that those moves are harder, um, though they do get progressively harder. They just they all work together, and so you have to like factor in the entire sequence in order to understand how the whole thing is going to function.
Yeah, it's that whole like the sum is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and I also think one thing that for people who haven't competed, how do I explain this? Like oftentimes, whether it's outdoors or indoor, normal setting, commercial setting, I feel like the last couple of moves often are just kind of easier, or they kind of let you lose a little bit of tension. Maybe you have to jump and cut, but like there's something that just there's a relaxation that often happens as you get towards the top, where comp boulders make you fight until the very last moment. And there's something very mentally taxing about actually finishing a boulder, especially a comp boulder. But I mean, in all sorts of it, I think that's kind of part of what you're getting at. I don't know if you have that same feeling when you're competing.
Yeah, and I mean, in a commercial setting, you might do that for other reasons, right? Like in a commercial setting, you might not want, especially you wouldn't. I mean, in a commercial setting, we can go into that as well, but like in a commercial setting, you want some sort of diversity. So you don't want to have every single climb that's like getting harder and harder at the top because that feels mundane and repetitive. But you also, from a risk standpoint, like if things get harder and harder as they get higher and higher, especially in a bouldering area, then you're just increasing the amount of risk that your clientele has to take. And so to that standpoint, there's other considerations from a commercial set of things.
Garrett, we cannot get into commercial boulder or
Yeah,
commercial saying too. Let's just
sorry.
it's a
Let's
whole nother world. That's like yeah.
get rid of it.
Uh, um, you keep saying risk, and there's this thing called the RIC scale. I'm not super familiar with, and I don't know if it's something that's still being employed or used in conversation. But can you talk more about this idea of risk and if it's if that scale is still being used or quantified when it comes to competition setting?
Yeah, yeah. The other, well, just to elaborate real quick on the last question you asked, and then I'll answer the risk, intensity, and complexity. The climbs themselves, like they are weighted in the sense that like you have 5, 10, 25. They're all worth 25 though. But what we aim to do is to have like one hard boulder, two harder boulders, and one hardest boulder. And so you sort of aim for that ideal. And the guidelines, again, the caveat here is like the guidelines give us an ideal and that a boulder should typically receive tops. An ideal lead route would have one person typically at the top. We would have one person with four tops, but and that's how you kind of like balance that equation. To go into your question about the risk, intensity, complexity, that's what that RIC scale stands for. I think the first person to put it into practice or come up with it was Tonde Catillo. Um, and and so yeah, the way it's used is you sort of like give this interpretation for what you believe to be the risk of a boulder, the intensity of the risk being like how how many times, or not how many times because that's a little bit more objective, but like at what level does the amount of risk required in that a climber has to go for something. So that's like that risk element, not necessarily the risk in terms of like safety, or secure. It's more like security in the sense that like they need to like do this or commit to doing this in order for that. So that's where that risk comes from. The intensity being like just how physically demanding it is. And then the complexity being like how hard is it to understand or conceive of doing something or perceive doing something. Um, However, I think the risk intent RIC scale had a big heyday for a while. Um, I would say we didn't use it much at all. We talk a lot about like the level of a climb, and we talk about elements of that, like, oh, this thing's hard to understand. This one's really physically demanding. That would probably be the hardest boulder. Or this one has like this much typically almost all moves at a World Cup level or Olympic level have a certain amount of risk involved with them. But I don't particularly love the Rick scale just because it seems to like overcomplicate things and add another layer of arbitrariness to an already arbitrary and subjective idea of difficulty. When I say V5, your perception of V5 might be very different than my perception of V5, or your perception of 7A might be different than my perception of 7A. And so there's already this subjective arbitrariness to what we do. And so I don't like to add like a secondary level to that. And so we tend to focus on just like how the competitors will react to the climbs. Will they be nervous? Will they understand? And focus a little bit more on like how many people might get to a certain particular area. And the other thing I'll say is like the idea that these climbs are 7A is just it's not true. Like anybody that tells you these kinds of, I even saw it on like some video recently with Toby or something, and he's saying, "Oh, I think that's like 7." No way, shape, or form. Like these climbers are so incredibly capable. Um, yeah, the idea that these climbs are 7A is just it's ludicrous.
Well, you said you had an idea around each boulder being, or that different boulders were known or thought to be more difficult than others within the round, whether it was the electric or the power. Uh, Can you take us to finals for the men and women and tell us which ones were the hardest and the easiest? And then just because you hinted at what are the grades of those boulders, or what did you think that they were approximately?
Well, I can tell you what we thought from the beginning. I can tell you like objectively at the end of the results based on what was hardest and easiest too. But I think a good example of this is the men's semifinals, right? What we thought was going to be the easiest climb. There was a pink electric boulder, boulder number two, actually ended up to be maybe not the hardest boulder objectively, but the hardest boulder that got done. It only had one top. And so it's just another example of like you don't get to predict or decide everything. I think to as a marker of success for us, it was certainly true that like those styles were represented on those boulders for the most part, but yeah, we anticipated that to be the easiest boulder. We anticipated the power boulder to be the hardest boulder. It was certainly hard, I think, but that being said, they were all quite hard. Um, and I think it maybe had three tops in the end, or maybe four. Boulder number one was the blue and yellow one over on the right side. Started off really powerfully with this compression. Um, the coordination didn't get done at all. That was supposed to be one of the second hardest the medium boulders, and then the slab, or not slab because it's actually 0 degrees, but the technical wrist boulder was supposed to be another like medium boulder, and I think that maybe got six tops. It was, the entire round of competition, I think, had right around 10 tops for semifinals, which was quite low. So that round was quite hard.
Did you did you guys feel like it was overcooked, and if so, how did you guys tweak the men's finals boulder based on what you saw in the semifinal?
Again, with the caveat of like being later in my career and knowing that, like, again, everything is different from round to round, right? Like, again, they have a preview now. They might have lower expectations because now they've made it into finals, or they might have more expectations because they want to get a podium and they want to get a medal for them and their country, and so they have more expectations. All of those things can factor in. And so, like, you can't glean too much, but for sure, we one of the things I think that stuck out most was particularly on the coordination, for example. The coordination was a little bit harder than anticipated to get to 5 and to 10, and therefore fewer people had opportunities to even try to get to 25. And so when we look at something like that, we think, okay, well, as a concept, we want more people to have more opportunities to get to trying 25. And so we maybe dial down a little bit what it means from to get from 5 to 10 and then ultimately to 25. So yes, we make some revisions between those two. But again, caveating it with, like, you just can't be certain because it's an entirely new round of competition with an entirely different set of boulders. And really the only thing that stays the same is like the styles that are represented. And as we discussed, the styles are, you know, one electric boulder is not another electric boulder. So,
Dude, it's so stressful being the route setter, man. I bet you were just as nervous. Okay, Garrett. I'm gonna push you again. What were some of the grades on the men's
oh,
and
sorry.
women's boulder finals? I'm just so curious. I just
That was the last part of your question. I totally forgot about that. Yeah, the grades on the climbs. There was nothing that was easier than between both men's and women's. There was nothing that was easier than 7C plus V10. Um, and that's to say, like, in some, like, there might be moves that are maybe slightly easier if you dial them down to just those individual moves. Um, and went all the way up to like AB plus V14.
holy
Like,
shit.
these climbers are, when I say that they are capable, they are they're just leagues beyond what your average climber is able to do. And you know, the I think we'll talk about this later too, but just what these people are capable of doing. And this is why when I hear people say, like, "Oh, they're not good rock climbers," what these people are also capable of doing on rock is mind blowing.
Uh, which boulder was an 8B plus or in that range? Me and Tim Kang were talking about men's power. I think it's the power boulder number 3 on the right side in the steep section, which for me was my favorite boulder to watch. I love that boulder, and me and Tim were like, oh, I don't know, it looks hard, like maybe like V12, like 8A plus. Uh, was that the hardest boulder?
Just to pull on to that boulder was probably 7C plus.
God,
Just to like pull on to that boulder. Maybe 7C. Again, like, it's subjective, right? So, but like that boulder and the first move was like probably 7C, like 8A, just to do the first move. And so, like, each of those movements in total to do, and then like to get into this like weird funky position at the end and keep it together, like, you add on that mental component as well. Yeah, easily 8B plus that boulder. The coordination boulder, again, like, and this is what's hard. Like, people say, oh, when you do it right, it's not so bad. But like, that's I, that's also just not true. Like, you start to learn the movements. Just because you do it doesn't mean it's gotten easier. Like, just because Simone Biles flips through the air 4 times and she's practiced it countless times doesn't mean it's easy. Like, the thought that something gets easier with practice is not true. It's still hard to execute.
I am blown away by how hard those boulders are and how many tops were done then, because yeah, it this must be really cool for you to see these athletes over and over again, what they're capable of, because you are incredibly strong. I assume everyone in your forerunning group is really strong. I mean, you've placed high, you've placed as high as fourth in bouldering nationals in your past. You've climbed really hard. How do you guys, when you're forerunning and thinking about these athletes, are you able to grok what they do, or are you often still surprised on some move that you just think, boy, like there's no way someone could bypass this move, like this crimp is just too small and that jump is too big. Like, do they still shock you?
Yeah, for sure, they still shock you at what they're capable of doing. We do our best to anticipate as many possible permutations of the boulder as we can, but ultimately, like these climbers are so exceptional that they're going to be able to do whatever it is that they want to do to some degree. And that is, yeah, I mean, again, like I think a less mature setter looks at that and thinks like, oh, they broke the beta. Oh, they did it in not the way I anticipated, and therefore I am a failure. But like that is what happens at the limits of human potential. Like people are going to surprise you. People are going to do incredible things, and that is incredible unto itself. Like the fact that they're able to do that. I'd say it's more disappointing when it looks like someone has found a way of doing something that looks exceptionally easier than another way of doing something. Those are some of the hardest moments to take, and something that you maybe didn't foresee, especially something you didn't foresee. But yeah, I mean, like to go back to like what these climbers are capable of doing. Like I think you all had said it previously, but like um, this idea of like the best should be rewarded. What is the best? What defines who the best are? Like again, I'll go to basketball. Reggie Miller, incredible basketball player, like also helped to redefine the game. Chris Paul, incredible basketball player. Karl Malone, incredible basketball player. Charles Barkley, all these people have never won a championship. What does it mean to be the best? Golden State Warriors went 73-9 one season and then didn't win the championship. Like, what does it mean to be the best and reward the best? Like in sport, the possibilities of what happens is what makes it so interesting. And, furthermore, this isn't rock climbing. This is the sport of climbing. And with that being said, though, like when these athletes get out on rock, look at what they do. Like, Seo did La Rambla in something like 8 tries. Yanya did Bugalessen. Brooke on Jade and box therapy. Um, Alex Magos going out just after the Olympics and doing change 515C or something, or 550. Like, I mean, to say that like we don't have the best rock climbers, or we don't have like it just blows my mind because these people are so incredibly good at this. And and that's what competition does. It's like the fine margins between who who gets to stand on the podium and who doesn't.
I'm right there with you on both ideas, where these are some of the best, these are the best climbers in the world, full stop, and that they're just showing up, improving it in any time they touch rock, plastic, board climbs, or whatever, whatever the case may be. And not conflating, not it's not even conflating, it's that. And then there's these wonderful sports moments, and that's why I sometimes I call it a show, and that can be seen almost like as a negative thing, that the Olympics are a show, but it was an exciting show to watch. And if instead we just looked on 8a.new and saw what their scorecard was and just granted them gold medals based on their past result, like, what are we doing? Like, what's the
Yeah,
point? Like, this is
totally.
not fun. God, yeah, I can't believe it is fun seeing what these athletes do in other scenarios right after the Olympics, where they take their training and just go like, oh, I guess I'll just go do a 9B plus in a couple of days. Like,
No big
good
deal.
job. Yeah. Um. All right, I lost my train of thought because I was just thinking about watching Magos in Norway do that stuff, and Yanya crushing Bugaleisen. I that what a video of her doing that. I really like that. Oh yeah, so on these sports moments, I guess my meta question is just were you guys happy with the outcome? Like, how do you feel about the competition? I will say again, I thought it was amazing, and I watching Yanya win and Brooke get second brought a tear to my eye because I'm lame like that, and just I thought it was a wonderful show. How did you guys feel about the outcome? And because the setting may have only played a minority 49% role, but you guys help or you guys set the stage at least.
Yeah, we definitely, I'll go back to that like 49, 49 2 example. Like it's part us, it's part the athletes, it's part luck. And, um, there were some really incredible moments, and some of those moments where you get to see that emotion pour out of these competitors and what it means to them are absolutely my favorite. Um, you brought up Brooke and Yanya crying together and like seeing what it meant to them. That's something that's like really, really special. I think one of the moments that stands out is like Colin screaming at the top and like almost falling off, grabbing that pocket, but managing to do it still and like seeing what that meant to him. It's yeah, like and the fact that it was the only top. Like we can't predict that if we wanted to. Like it's so hard to do that when you're working with those finer margins. But that is what makes those moments so special. And yeah, I mean, like they stand up to me for like some of the. I don't want to say I compare it to these moments, but like, Kobe Bryant stepping up to the line with a torn Achilles or going off for 81 points or Curry's buzzer beater against OKC, like LeBron's block against arguably one of the best teams ever to win against that 73-9 team. And so, yeah, like I'll again caveat that with like, we shouldn't control the results. Like if we told the officials that every single score needed to be 99 and 100 every single game or 0-1 every game or whatever the case may be, like that's not sports. That's not why we watch. We watch for to be upset. We watch to be intrigued. And if we started to look at it differently and say like, well, it was just a hard round of boulders, especially at the World Cup individual discipline level. Instead, if we got rid of some of those expectations and said like, wow, it was just a really hard round of boulders today. It wasn't the fault of the route setters. They didn't do something wrong. Um, but it was just a really hard round of competition. And man, instead, if we focused on like, wow, look at who performed today or look at who didn't perform today. Like that's what we want to see from sports. We want to see who performed.
On that note of Colin sticking that, I think that was men's number 4, and it was a big move onto of standing onto a volume and then stabbing into. I don't know if I even want to call that two finger puck. It's like two monos, and
Yeah.
I personally, by the way, I love watching Colin. I just think there's something about Colin's style, and then his kind of quiet countenance that then explodes when he succeeds. I love watching Colin. One of my favorite. I thought he was maybe gonna podium. He was on my bingo card there. Um, when you guys decided on that final hold, did you guys think about like why did you pick like a double mono? Because watching Serato almost he fumbled that last. I don't want to say fumbled. He did not stick that last
That's
move, but
fair.
he was very close, and that would have probably. Well, hindsight
Could have secured.
is
Yeah.
different, but it was
Maybe he
it.
goes into it with more confidence and then doesn't do as well on the read. Yeah, who knows?
Okay, well then let me not even try to guess. Why did you guys? How did you all choose that hold?
As route setters, this goes back to like the sort of like fundamentals of what we do. We're also looking to provide something different or something that they haven't seen before. Um, and so you don't want to like just repeat the same sort of like paddle over and over again for coordination, right? And so some people might look at that even and say like, oh, well, that was electric, right? And that's where that stylistic interpretation comes in. But this idea that they would have to have the coordinated effort to get enough out of traveling all the way across, landing on top of this volume, smearing. So again, it takes so many different elements, that risk and balance, and then be able to like have enough time there to stab into the two finger mono, as you put it, um, was something that's different and could be like surprising to the competitors. And so like we always look to challenge the competitors in a variety of different ways instead of doing the same thing over and over again.
I that makes sense, and I love it, but it still blows my mind that you guys could come up with that hold, which is, I mean, look, someone that maybe is less experienced might think like, oh, it's just kind of like two mono pockets next to each other. But that is a very strange hold to encounter in your normal day to day routine, normal day to day climbing. It's very different to put a two finger pocket. It gives you a little more margin of error. And, these people are so strong too that anyway, it changes the move substantially. And I guess I'm wondering, do you have like a journal? Like, where do you get your inspiration from, Garrett?
Um, you'll come to events with like certain moves you want to do. I think this was also a question you had later for us, but like you'll come to events that you have like certain movements either from climbing around in the gym, from climbing on rock, from watching other people, from watching competitions. This goes back to the idea that like we stand on the shoulders of giants. Uh, if we hadn't had Manu, do we even have the paddle? If we hadn't had Laurent, do we even have the paddle? If we don't have those holds, do we even have the paddle? Um, and so yeah, the inspiration comes from like this synthesis of seeing years and years and sort of like regurgitating some of that and building off of that to create something new or different. I would say different is a better word because I think that's a small hurdle that some setters, especially newer setters, can get stuck on is like we want to create something new that no one's ever seen before. And fundamentally, like climbing is you've got side pulls, you've got Gastons, you got down pulls, you got underclings. Like fundamentally, we're doing a lot of the same movements. Sure, was that paddle different from a different paddle? Was that coordination different from this coordination? Sure, it was different, but it's coordination if we like boil it down. Um, so where we get the inspiration it comes from so many different places, and I'd say going back to this idea, like I just set this out or helped to do this L1, and one of the things I tell setters is you might have ideas, they're not going to work out every time, and so one of the best things you can do is to have humility and to be adaptable and be able to go in a different direction when things aren't working out as you anticipated.
I, I I think one of the cool things in competition climbing and with these great athletes is that this almost sounds like I'm taking saying down a notch. So forgive me. I don't mean to offend, but in some ways you do put these holds and you may have an idea, but in some ways what makes these special sports moments is when athletes come up with an entirely different way. Like they create a new move in a way. It's rather than you, it's like they go, oh, look, you, but you didn't think of this, Garrett. And they do something wild. Yeah. Okay. One thing that was somewhat different about the Olympics is this combined format of having lead climbing and bouldering be tested in the same competition and be combined as the way the scoring worked. And something I was really astonished by was how well it seemed like the points stacked up where how do I put this? It's like Yanya got 80 something points on bouldering and 80 something points on lead. And I just was curious what the coordination was like between you and the head setter for the lead climbing and how that came to be where, in other cases too, it might be like Mori is known to be a lead specialist and she scored better on lead versus bouldering. That may seem obvious to some people, but to me, it seems very difficult to make that actually happen like we all expected it to.
Yeah, just like we planned it. No. Um, I would honestly chalk that up to like that 2% of luck. Like the we did the absolute best we could to represent the styles of electric, power, coordination, technical risk, and have that round of boulders be that round of boulders. They did their absolute best on the lead side to have that route be progressive and have it get incrementally harder all the way through. And so those climbers that were best at both disciplines were able to show that prowess and be able to show that ability to do both exceptionally well. And those that were more performant in one discipline over another were able to show that because those disciplines represented themselves well. The fact that she gets almost the exact same amount of points in both, again, even if we wanted to, even if we could, is that right?
Well, me and Tim King were talking about this whole thing where deciding how much to weight lead versus bouldering for the combined medal. And you said this earlier. You were talking about how there was no youth category for bouldering when you were competing. And when I competed, and this is back in like JCCA days, there was no bouldering, like bouldering like didn't even really exist. And so, that's like a whole nother topic of deciding how heavy to weight lead versus boulder and why we might argue that way. And I'm not even sure if it's, that's just kind of almost hindsight too. Like how should it be weighted? So
Yeah, and sports evolve and things even, people say our rules change all the time, but like every year there's a new rule book for the NFL. Every year there's a new rule book for the NBA and officials are told what to look for and what to do differently and how to officiate different things and that's how sports get better.
just as a side note, I want to say that I know you were not the head setter for the lead routes. They were incredible. I really, really enjoyed them. And I also liked the color combination of showing the different sections of the route. It just
Not coincidence.
Yeah, of course, of course, of
Yeah.
course. I just shout out. I'm not sure who did it, but your colleague there did a great job as well, and just want to take the time to say thanks to whoever they were.
Yeah, that was Martin Hammer and his team. Coincidentally, the first person when I was a forerunner at the Vail World Cup in 2014, he let me set my first World Cup boulder problem, and and so yeah, it was really cool to go full circle with him, like 10 years later, to be the head route setter of the Olympics with him and his team on lead.
Small world, very cool. I said something about Imori, and I just would like to touch on her. It's a subject that the internet seems to like to yell about, and I don't know. I'll summarize. I shouldn't even summarize. I'll say some of the things that get brought up around Imori, that she's shorter and she's 5'1". And for reference, Brooke is 5'2", and Brooke won silver. So just putting that out there. I'm not going to take any big conclusions there. And Imori did not place so well in bouldering, but excelled in lead. And some of the people said that she struggles in bouldering due to her lack of dynamic or jumping ability. And then some people will argue that bouldering tests that too heavily. I'm not sure how they decide that they're the arbiter of the guidelines while they're on Reddit, but just putting out the argument there. But how do you feel, or was there any kind of post mortem about I's performance in lead and bouldering, or just let's talk. Let's touch on that subject and hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. You know, I was actually just talking to somebody today that was like, "Oh, did you see this thing?" I didn't see that thing. Um, but what I will say is like to the point, to the like sort of nuts and bolts of it, the fact that I is 5'1" and Brooks 5'2", what they're listed at is maybe different than what they're at in real life. And uh, is that 1 inch really the thing that prevented her from being able to do that. I think when taken in combination with, oh, here comes the dogs. Apologies.
Hello. No worries.
Um, when taken in combination, let me start over. The fact that I is 5'1", when taken in combination with her own admittance, again, this was told to me secondhand, so I don't know how true this is. I was just talking to someone today about this, but she said that I had, she didn't want to stay. Uh, I had said that in like a post interview, I should have trained my legs better. And the fact that she is readily saying that, I think points to something that was lacking in her climbing. Uh, and regardless of what round of competition is, your legs are required. And so I'll also say there was so much discussion on the setting team between balancing what it was like for a short person versus a tall person versus the person that has disability versus that ability without naming names, of course. Um, was it easier for somebody that was taller? Maybe. Maybe it was a little bit easier for somebody that was a little bit taller and could jump to those two holds. Was it possible for I? I think witnessed by the fact that she says I should have trained this better. I think as evidenced by the fact that Brooke does it and is only a couple centimeters taller than her, if that, like maybe 1 centimeter taller than her. I think as evidenced by the fact that she grabbed it several times and wasn't able to do it, as evidenced by the fact that our forerunners who are of similar size, I'm not particularly tall, but our forerunners of similar size, the women that foreran and set with us, could get leaps and bounds like 10 centimeters above that hold. As evidenced by all those things, I don't think it's due to just a height thing. I think what happened was I showed that she was deficient in this style of climbing. And unfortunately for her, that means that she didn't get to attempt the rest of that boulder. But like I'll go back to something I think that was said previously on your podcast. It sucks that that was what held her back or whatever, but that's what happens in sports. It sucks that they didn't make that free throw. It sucks that they false started on the line. It sucks that they had one opportunity to run that 100-meter dash and that their entire career, maybe they were the best 100-meter sprinter and they happened to trip or false start or whatever the case may be. But like that's sports. That can happen. And and that's what happened on that day. Like, I didn't do that. And that's on her. That's not just on us. That's as equally on her as equally on us, maybe. But like, that's in large part due to her abilities.
Yeah, I actually I totally agree, and I think I'm one to push back when people say, "Oh, like I got robbed or whatever," and I think it's that hindsight is not 2020. Where let's say she had gone and trained a ton of legs. Let's say she had gotten her jumping ability way better. Maybe she puts on a bunch of leg muscle, doesn't spend as much time on route climbing, and she falls way lower on the route because she's not as endurance oriented, and then she places worse. And I
Yeah.
just it's and also that example you just gave of, hey, people ran 100 meters, but on that day they got sick. They had they stubbed their toe that morning. To me, what makes sports fun actually is almost this like talk about, oh, but my favorite athlete is that one, even though they didn't win. And like I was talking to you, Garrett, where I was looking at your 8A scorecard and you got the second ascent of Clockwork Orange, which is just a V12, or probably some might argue that it's a V12, a hard V12 in Las Vegas that no one does because it's really difficult. And so for me, because I kind of know, I'm like, damn, Garrett, that was awesome. Not your hardest climb, but for me, it's like special. And so I think that's part of what makes it fun. And talking about athletes is it's like you have this thing you enjoy and like, and the person's your hero because of X, Y, and Z. It can't just always be, well, they won gold, so they're my favorite because they won gold. It's like that's not how the world works.
Yeah, no, it's not. And like, is that fair, quote unquote? No, like, is it fair that the way I did Clockwork Orange is very different than the way the first Ascensionist did Clockwork Orange? I don't know. You want to call that fair? You want to call that just like adapting? You want to call that whatever you want to call it, right? But but yeah, it's that's why I love watching is because it's intriguing because we don't know what's going to happen because even though Golden State went 73-9, it's possible that they don't win. Carlos, spoiler alert, Carlos Alcaraz just lost yesterday to ranked third in the world, has won Wimbledon this year, has won the French Open this year, has won got the silver medal at the Olympics and then gets knocked out in the second round to a qualifier, somebody that wasn't even seeded into the US Open. Is that fair? Like, I, it happens though.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it also brings up this idea of knowing when to lean into your strengths versus work on your weaknesses. And, should Steph Curry have tried to get taller, drink more milk when he was young, work on his vertical leap and try to be a dunking machine, or should he have really worked on his free or his 3-point shooting? And this is the what great athletes do is they figure out their way. And you do see Imori do things. I mean, she did that quote unquote power boulder, and I don't know. She probably didn't have the biggest biceps, and this is why power is always an interesting way to describe those boulders. But that was a good example, and because my mom is like 4'10" or 4'9". My poor mom. She was watching, and she said, "Oh, look at that poor girl." And I was like, "Just keep watching, see what happens. Like, just wait." And then she was the first one to top the
Yeah.
probably the hardest, technically or whatever, grade wise is my guess the hardest women's boulder, and she did it with style too.
Well, again, if we go back and look objectively, we'd have to say the hardest boulder, and that's why this idea you said like, oh, Clockwork's not the hardest boulder; it's a hard V12 or whatever people might argue it, but like the fact that not a whole lot of people do it, I think says something about that thing. And equally so, the fact that not a whole lot of people, or in fact, no one did the fourth women's boulder, I think objectively says something about how hard that boulder was. And people can say, oh, but Yanya didn't climb in the way that she normally climbed. And sure, that's true. But like, also, nobody did it. And also, a couple of people did the power boulder over there on the right profile and so you can only you can only glean from that what you can glean from that.
I mean, it's one of the fun things about climbing is and it's why I like those 8A scorecards and stuff because you can have these people who say I climbed this, I climbed V10, look it's this one, and then you can look at someone else's V10, you're like, you climbed that? Oh, you did it in July? You did it in the middle of summer and it's 30 feet tall as your first V10? And just
Totally.
like and that's fun. I think that's fun and exciting. Uh on that grade note, I gotta ask you how hard those lead finals were that the men and women were on.
You bring up a super interesting point. I've always like dreamed of, I coached kids for a long time and so the other thing too is like there's a big difference between what V5 is for us, an average sized person versus what V5 is for someone else or what a crimp is for someone else that's like 10 years old versus what a crimp is for me. And so like I've always dreamed of like, 8A being somehow or some platform being able to somehow say like, people of this height typically do this or this boulder typically gets done at this weather like or this part of the year or something along those lines. It would just be like interesting statistics to have. I'm a big fan of statistics too. So as to how hard those boulders were, again, super subjective. If I had to put grades on them, like that boulder over on the right side, the power boulder, um, like in sum total, V13. Um, Like it's hard. It's really hard.
Wow.
Um, and the coordination boulder, you'll hear people that say, "Oh, when you do it right, it's V7." But like again, you have some of the strongest people in the world not doing it, and again, the variables being like performance and anxiety and et cetera, et cetera. But like it's super hard to put those things together and to do those things all in a row. Um, so that coordination boulder, again, maybe the same, maybe harder if you try to do it objectively. Uh, the electric boulder, just this jump alone, after you do the first run and jump move, which was itself maybe like 7C, uh, then this jump like itself is maybe like 7C, 7C plus, and then to get to the top, maybe like slightly, maybe about the same, but just really committing. So maybe 7C plus there, and then over on the slab, I don't know, 11, 12. Yeah,
Jeez.
people will contend all day long with that, but again, it's subjective.
I love hearing your opinion on this stuff as someone who's a setter and all your other experience, because I feel like athletes don't have necessarily the best take on it because they're hyped up, they're out there, they don't always understand how good they are in that moment either. Um, and I also think it's interesting where you point out this is just kind of almost a comment on grading where it's like, okay, it's X grade, but no one did it. So is it that grade? Like, and the one next to it is the same grade. It's something I had this discussion. I'm blanking on who it was. It often happens on these like granite climbs. Oh, I was talking to Carlo about the dark side, which is a V16. He proposed V16 in Yosemite, and he's like, yeah, one of the tricky things is you only get maybe one attempt or two attempts every couple of weeks, even the height of season, because conditions are so dependent. And then, is that the same as a V16 that you can get 30 days on a year in perfect conditions, and it's maybe, anyways.
Yeah,
I know that you didn't set the lead routes, but any care to guess what the grades on the men's and women's finals are for those ones?
again, it would be like, yeah, I don't know, but to the point, no one really knows. So, yeah, you're talking at least 14 plus range for the men, probably into like the 15A range, um, and then you're talking like 14D probably for the women. Like
Wow.
it's and again, as evidenced by the fact that you have someone like Chayun Seyo doesn't top the route. This is the only thing we can really compare it to, right? But like she doesn't top the route, and then she does something like La Rambla in 8 tries or less. So like, how does that stack up? Like,
I appreciate you answering these questions for me, man. I feel like it can be a bit of a uncool or taboo question, but I just sometimes I ask myself this idea where if I was if I'm going to talk to Garrett Gregor, and one of the top setters was there at the Olympics, and it's like, what is like a question that, of course, I have to ask, and I just thank you for sharing and being open to answering questions that I feel like I don't know sometimes they can be frowned upon, but I know that everyone sitting there watching the Olympics that's a climber is wondering, yeah, but how hard is this really? And they're freaking hard.
yeah, they're freaking hard, and like, just to go back to this idea of like and who should or shouldn't win, like the there's again, I think Tim might have said like, or people online say like they're too selective for climbers, right? They like to put too much priority on this style or that style. But like, there's a reason we see some climbers time and time again on the podium, like Yanya and Tamoa, a 7-time World Cup winner, Shauna, Killian. Like these great athletes find ways to adapt and win. And so yeah, I think like that's what you have to do to be great in this sport is find ways to adapt and to be able to like leave your mark.
On that note, I know that you had listened to the podcast Tim Kang and I did. I think it was episode number 112 where we were just foaming at the mouth of excitement after watching the Olympics and sharing our uninformed takes. And I know that perhaps me or Tim said some things that you wanted to, I don't know, not take issue. You wanted to expand on or disagree on. And what were some of those things that you wanted to share?
Well, I've kind of like alluded to a few of them. That one being one of them, right? That like this idea that who should win, who is the best, are these rock climbers that win? Why don't we see great rock climbers? Aiden Roberts, I think, was used as an example, going out and doing this. Well, we see Alex Magos, who's arguably one of the greatest rock climbers of all time, going and doing these things and not winning. Does that tell you something? Like sometimes, like there's an element of pressure that comes along with these things, and like being involved in competition climbing, like why do some high level competitors like not do that? Like, well, maybe there's a better economic incentive for them to keep rock climbing, and they have sponsors that prioritize that, or maybe it's that they have more of an economic incentive to go do comps because they saw some notoriety from that and have a following for that. Like, or maybe they just don't like that pressure. But like Billie Jean King said, like pressure is a privilege, and like the ability to like thrive under that pressure is, I mean, that's where you see those true moments come out. And like, there's also been like over the years pushback from athletes who don't want to see scoreboards, but like those are the moments that we want to see. Like when somebody steps up to the free throw line and knows they have to make this free throw in order for their team to win, that's pressure. That's like millions of dollars. Their family's like uh, health and well being on the line each and every game and knowing what they have to like, and that's a privilege. That's truly a privilege. And so I think like in order to advance the sport truly, like we have to get over this idea that climbers climbing is climbing and we need to keep it rock climbing and we need to keep it small, or we need to keep things hidden, and like we need to be transparent and we need to allow people to experience our sport, and that's what's going to make climbing like advance to the next level.
Dude, pressure is a privilege. I freaking love that concept, and it's something I often talk about with why I like climbing. And I have competed my whole life in one form or another of different sports, and I've also liked doing kind of scarier boulders and climbs because I always say, like I just like finding out what I'm made of in those moments, and that you cannot know. You might think you know who you are, you might think, and then you find out. And I really like that. I'm gonna I'm gonna try to steel man a different side of things and see what you think. Okay, so climbing has changed a lot in the competition scene since you started. We've seen
Yeah.
a big evolution in just the style. So if a 10-year-old is sitting there and wants to be a really fast sprinter, they can probably guess what they need to do. It's like, I need to run a shorter time than anyone else. And again, I'm not saying I believe this, just bear with me. I'm just trying to steel man another side of things.
Yeah, yeah.
If you told a
I'm
10-year,
super glad you're bringing this up because this was another topic that I had on the list that yeah, go ahead.
cool, I'll just try to set up the context for it then. But if you're a young kid and you just watch the Olympics and decide that you want to be gold medalist in, I don't know, country whatever 32, and you decide that you're going to be the best climber you can be, those guidelines that you talked about, electric, power, all these things feel very amorphous, and it's hard uh, for me to be able to tell a 10-year-old, like, you need to have these attributes and these skills to know that you're going to have success in the competition scene in 10 years. um, yeah, am I saying that right for why
Yeah.
that it's kind of hard
No,
to
I
understand how
totally
that would work in
understand.
climbing? Okay, go
Yeah,
ahead then.
I totally understand. And so you were a gymnast, right?
Correct.
And so what they did in gymnastics 20 years ago is radically different than what they do now, right?
You're right.
And so like you don't have I mean, I think it was outlawed because it was doing damage to people's like internal organs or something. But for the females, uh, like you no longer have, I don't know what the skill is called, but like where they sort of like bounce with their abdomen.
It's like the death. It's like it's some awful name too, but it was really for safety reasons, and they've made some tweaks to different apparatus. Like the vault used to be the pommel horse, and then it would face you, so they'd have like a one side was like really scary. And someone actually died doing a vault, and so they changed it, and that actually. Sorry, I'm leading into. Go
No,
ahead. Go
talk
ahead.
about danger. Talk, no,
Well,
no, please.
well, they changed the vault, so now it's instead of it being a pommel horse that could be twisted sideways, they made the vault kind of smooth and round. But it definitely changes the event. It not just the danger, but how you can block off of that and where your hands go because now it's wider. It really changes the way a vault might work.
Right. And so I bring that up just to say, like, you know, if you were to tell a 10-year-old, right, there's two parts of this. If you were to tell a 10-year-old right now, what does it take to be the greatest gymnast? Well, what it's going to take to be the greatest gymnast in 10 years might be a little bit different than what it takes to be the greatest gymnast today. And what it takes to be the greatest climber in 10 years might be a little different than what it takes to be today. And in all sports, that ability to adapt to your environment and do the best you can is what makes those people great. And so like that's why you see Steph Curry like not working on his vertical jump and trying to like adapt and fit into the game, but do what he does and be great at that. And so, you know, we could rattle off a number of skills that you need to do right now in order to be good at this. And if I was coaching someone, I might have them focus on this or that. But like sports evolve and you need to evolve with them. And the the second part of that is like that's not incorrect that sports evolve. They evolve for certain reasons because of danger or to get more notoriety or to get more people involved in the sport, whatever the case may be. And that's not a bad thing. That just means like the sport is evolving and people push back on that change, I think often because they're afraid of that change. But it's or want to be relevant still or whatever the case may be. But this idea that like things have to stay the same, um, I think doesn't hold true in any sport.
I think people also desire certainty. They want to know that they're going to win, right? And
Something
that's
I'm working
just
on in
not.
therapy.
But you know that feeling where you like, I want to know that I've done what it takes, but that's not how sports moments work. It's that extra 2%. And I don't know if I don't know if I shared this with you before, but something that I'm really obsessed with in climbing is this evolution of climbing because I'm old and I started about 30 years ago and I've witnessed a lot of evolution. I was one of the first gym kids. And so I really had this dynamic style, probably coming from gymnastics as well. And it was kind of frowned upon. I'd say Chris Sharma was kind of my mentor of pioneering that kind of jumping and latching. And then over the years, you see like more toe hooking, you see knee pads, you see Dave Graham take knee barring to a level not seen before. And I gotta tell you, it's very tempting for me to dislike what's new because I'm bad for it or I'm bad at it. And it's very tempting for me to say, oh, this doesn't translate to what I view even rock climbing as. And my favorite example is there's that paddle dynoing. So I'm not going to explain it here because my whole point is that my audience knows these things, and I like to talk about that climb industry of cool in Rocklands, which is a paddle dyno that goes around V12 or something like that. And my argument is always like Fred Nicole would not have done that boulder even though he is physically capable of climbing much harder because that was a new technique that got opened up along the way, maybe even through indoor climbing. And so we see the sport evolve even in a competition scene. It unlocks things outdoors, it unlocks possibilities. It's just the progression is always good. It always grows the sport in a positive way.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I don't know which boulder you're referencing specifically, but like, we might see people 7, 10 years from now that like come along with a totally different body type that have been involved in climbing a different way that figure out a totally different way of doing it. And is that like, is that easier? Just because, I mean, this like points to like the sexism I think that exists in sports, but like for so often, like when a woman did something, it was like almost automatically downgraded in our sport. And like, what does that say about what grades mean? Like, is it just there to like boast our or like put up our ego, or is it really a representation of what that thing is?
Hmm. Yeah, that was a sinister thing that probably still happens, man. I'm not so sure that is any different today. Yeah. Uh, okay, well, I actually think that's a little bit interesting to link into something we touched on before. I just wanted to close that loop of our competition climbers. Are these top competition climbers that we see in the Olympics the best climbers, and how do we square that with someone like Adam Ondra, who has climbed 15D, and I don't think anyone's ever climbed 15. Silence is stands alone still.
Maybe they haven't given it that, but
Okay, okay.
yeah, yeah.
Like how do you feel about seeing, or maybe not even how you feel about seeing, just do you have any thoughts that we haven't covered already around would someone who's a indoor competition specialist, if we decided to, or if they decided to completely shift to being only an outdoor sport climber, do you think that they would crush Adamandra, or is that just a total misrepresentation of how climbing works in general?
Mm, I don't know if it's like I don't know if it's not a characterization of how climbing works in general, but um, in 10 years from now, like well, presuming climbing stays along the same trajectory, climbers are going to have access to even more facilities and even more styles of route setting, and that's going to increase like the styles of route setting that come out of that. That's going to increase the abilities that climbers have over the years. And so I guess what I'm getting at is like, if somebody just does one thing, does that mean that they're going to get good at that thing? And this goes back to the point you were making before that like if you were to tell a 10-year-old like go just try hard on rock, like is that going to make them great at that thing? Not necessarily. Like there's so many elements to that. And I wanted to like touch on one other thing you said there, which is like, we could boil it down to um, saying, in order to be good at comp climbing or the sport of climbing, you need to top as many boulders as you can, or you need to top as many routes as you can. And we could boil sprinting down to you need to be as fast as you can. But does that mean you do squats? Does that mean that you do jumps? Does that like, and even if you do those squats, like we talked about those sprinters that might get to that Olympic level and might get to that finals race and still not win. Like nothing is guaranteed in life. And so, yeah, to put it all into to come back to your point now, like it's not necessarily that like one way is going to work for every single person, but I think in 10 years from now, like we're going to see things that we didn't think were possible. We're going to see, or people are going to start to realize that like, oh, maybe that thing was 515D, or have a different way of grading things entirely based on weather and height and whatever other factors go into making climbs relevant.
All right, still trying to live with that uncertainty. It made me think of something that we were talking a little bit before. I shared that I learned how to set from my buddy Moses Potter. Shout out Moses, great OG climber. And when I was learning how to set, a guy, I feel I shouldn't even say his name, because if I maybe how I understood what he was trying to communicate to me. So sorry, Moses, if I get this wrong, was that indoor climbing was training for outdoor climbing. So if we had a side pole, then he would often ask that you put either a push foot to kind of make better use of that side pull, or perhaps a heel hook on the other side to kind of, again, make that tension present. And that his thinking was that when you went outside, this would help people understand how to read rock outside. And if they grabbed a side pull, they would automatically look to kind of get that opposition. And so indoor climbing historically has led to us training for outdoor climbing. And what you're saying that kind of made me think about this is my what I wonder is, with competition setting and the evolution we've seen in it, does it then does it flip the thinking there, where in some ways perhaps you do things that are completely different in indoor climbing that then help you outdoors, even though it doesn't look like outdoors? Like, are we exploring a whole way of movement and climbing that is adding to the climbing knowledge that we all can acquire that we maybe never could acquire on rock? So rather than it being indoor climbing being a subset of outdoor climbing, we've now fully switched where it's, more things can happen in indoor climbing than could ever happen indoor climbing. I don't know. That's kind of philosophical out there, but I'll leave it at that.
I'll try to answer that. I think I'd need to take some time to think about that, honestly. Um, but what comes to mind is like the quote about, if you have, how does it go? Like if you have a hammer, or if you have a nail and a hammer, well then every solution is fixed by a hammer, or something like that. You know what I'm getting
I
at?
know what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, if you have a hammer, everything's fixed by a hammer, right? And so the more tools you have to employ, the more opportunities you have available. Like, I think back to the technology we have, like the technology we have today. Could anyone in 1920 without a television had ever thought that we would be talking to each other like thousands of feet apart or thousands of miles apart, and be able to communicate in real time and record that and to distribute that to so many people? Like, probably not. um but it's like how we build off of each iteration and how we get better. And so, like, yeah, 10 years from now, like, who knows what's going to be possible or what people are going to be capable of doing or not doing.
Yeah, I think what, and we let's not go down this esoteric path. I think what prompted my thinking was that you were talking about how, let's say you wanted to be a great sprinter, maybe you do squats, maybe you do jumps, maybe you just sprint, but it's like, who knows? And it made me think, maybe you're 10 years old and you want to climb the world's first 16A on rock, but maybe the best way to do that might be climbing on plastic competitions, which historically people wouldn't have thought that was the right tool for that job. And I just find that interesting, how things evolve, and perhaps like the answer to these questions may not be exactly what you think they are right now.
And going back to that idea of like, just because you tell somebody that, they want that certainty, and that, like, I do this thing, I do X, therefore Y. Like, that is not how it works. It's not this like nice linear progression where X is equal to Y. It's like sometimes you're going to get good, sometimes you're going to drop down, sometimes you're going to plateau. And ultimately, it's not guaranteed that you're going to get there, plain and simple, no matter how many squats you do. Like, it's not.
Yeah. It makes me think of how I think one of the pushbacks that I have for people who see the competition, see Yanya go out and do Bugalize and sit. She is incredible. And then people go, see, look, like, whoever wins the Olympics or these competition climbers are the best. And then someone else says, yeah, well, look at like Adam Ondra climbing silence. He's the best. And what I hear from this is like, who knows? Let's go put him on a climb. And who knows what's going to happen that day? And the absolute opposite might happen the next day. It depends on the climb, the
Yeah.
moment, the day. Yeah.
All it tells you is who was best that day. And like, I got fourth in 2013. Does that mean I was like better than everybody else? No, that day I happened to get fourth place or whatever the case may be. And like, there's debates all the time. Who's the best basketball player? Was it Michael Jordan? Was it Magic Johnson? Was it Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? What, like, is it LeBron James? Like, what does the best is different to different people and different people's interpretation of what the best is. And unless, yeah, I just think like this idea that we try to look at the world in black and white, and the world is not black and white.
Yeah, you're right, man. At that same nationals I was at, where I didn't make semis, I was probably better than you. It just so happened that that day you got fourth. I it wasn't my fault that I just didn't make out qualies. Um, okay, man. Ah, so good, so much good stuff. Too many other topics. I let's uh let's get your how you go from good to great before we close it out.
Um, yeah, I like that you do this. And I'll also say that, people want um, that magic bullet or the like one thing that's gonna get them there. But like, it's not going to be any one thing. I'll just preface this by saying it's not going to be this one thing. It's not going to be that one thing. It's going to be a multitude of things, and even then, it's not guaranteed. But that, like going through the process and learning how to work with uncertainty and trying even in the face of uncertainty is what's going to make you great. Uh, but that's not the like good to great. What I'll say is like the change the things you can, and don't worry about the things you can't. And to the to that point, there's like one thing that's always in your control. And so, like I said, I used to coach athletes for many, many years. In fact, like Colin and Brooke were both came out of the program in the cohort that I used to coach. And so it's so cool to like have seen them both like be at the Tokyo Olympics and now to be in Paris and have Brooke won a medal. And like, yeah, I mean, that's just a totally surreal thing to like see this cohort of climbers that have just, yeah, it's incredible. Um, but yeah, like change the things you can. Don't worry about the things you can't. And the one thing that's always in your control is the amount of effort you give on any given day. Like you might wake up and be puking and have the flu or have had food poisoning or whatever the case may be, but you can still go out and give your 100%, whatever it is on that given day. And that's really the one thing that we control. There's so many things we look to for that certainty of like things that we can control. And like that's all within us each and every day. And whether that's like going and doing your homework or going and doing your squats or like that self discipline and ability to control what's within your purview is great. And like, don't blame it on the refs. Don't blame it on the route setters. Like, control what you control and try to get better from there.
Super good, man. And it's exactly what we had kind of you had kind of hinted about when we were talking about Steph Curry and him only being 6 feet tall. And you had made that statement when we had chatted last time about athletes find a way to make their impact felt. And it's not complaining. You can't change the height of the hoop. You can't change your height. And I also got to point out that Maury did not come out and complain about anything. She said maybe I could have done this differently, and so good on her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I second that.
Garrett, for people who want to know more about you or know about wherever you're working on, is there any place they can follow you?
Um, yeah, well, there's a couple of things I think I'd want to say, and one is yeah, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm not a huge Insta follower. You can just find me at Garrett Gregor, 2 R's, 2 T's, Gregor, Gregor. I'm trying to do better about having more of a social media presence, but I don't do it so well. Um, and I guess the one thing I want to leave people with in that regard of like controlling the things that you control is like I hear a lot of people say like, you know, we we want this to change or they did this and like this we could get like political now too and like they didn't fix that or they should be spending money on this. But like within USA Climbing and the things that we control, there's so many volunteers that help to run this organization and there's so many people that are helping to make the sport better. And just recently on like an athlete's call or like a call for athletes, we sent out to like I think over 1,000 athletes or something, and we got back like two responses or something like that. And it's like instead of sitting on the sidelines, like instead of saying like these people should make the sport better, like be the change that you want to see and like volunteer and make the sport better and like help out, because like that's how we get to new iterations of the sport. That's how we get to new formats. That's how we make everything better for everyone with more people's input. And so I did want to leave with that. And like, I volunteer at USA Climbing as well. I've been on the athletes committee for a number of years, the nominating committee for a number of years. And so that's where you can find me too.
Well said, man. I love that. I often say it's easy to complain or easy to tear other people down, really hard to build something. And so that willingness to put your thoughts into actions versus just writing a snarky post. It's just, you're not going to change anything. You might make yourself feel better because you tried to tear someone else down, but it's really, if you really do want to see something change, well, then go change it.
Yeah.
Garrett, thank you so much. I am just blown away by the amount of different impacts you've had on the world of climbing, the coaching, the climbing itself, the route setting. I am, again, really grateful for you taking the time to come on here and share what you did. And I love this one, man. Thank you.
Likewise. Well, thank you. And yeah, hopefully we can do it again someday.
Sounds great, man. There's a few topics. We had to prune a few branches that we could have gone down because there's just too much. And that just shows how much you know, man. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like even more content, go to patreon.com/testpiece. And while you're at it, share this podcast with someone you know who would love it. And please leave us a review or rating at wherever you get your podcasts. We've also got tons of great content on YouTube and Instagram, so don't forget to like and subscribe there. Okay, see you next week.